The desert wind kicked up dust around Clara Wilson's ankles as she stepped off the stagecoach, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild Mustang. Glenrio, New Mexico Territory, 1879, this dusty crossroads would be her fresh start, far from the scandals and whispers of Philadelphia society. She clutched her carpet bag with white-knuckled fingers, the worn fabric as out of place in this frontier town as she was. Clara smoothed down the front of her dress, a creation she'd sewn herself from a pattern she'd found in a ladies' magazine. The pale blue cotton with its hand-embroidered collar had seemed so practical when she'd made it. But now, standing beneath the merciless western sun, she realized how eastern it looked. The fabric was too light, too delicate for this harsh landscape, and the elaborate embroidery she'd been so proud of seemed foolish and fussy. She'd spent her last dollars on the stagecoach ticket, pinning every hope on the teaching position that awaited her at Glenrio's newly established schoolhouse. 22 years old, unmarried, and alone, the whispers had followed her all the way from Pennsylvania. Poor Clara Wilson, jilted at the altar and cast out by her family. The stagecoach driver tossed down her trunk, raising another cloud of dust. "Good luck to you, miss," he said before climbing back onto his perch. With a crack of his whip, the horses lurched forward, leaving Clara alone on the main street of a town that seemed more mirage than reality. Glenrio was little more than a collection of wooden buildings stretched along a single dirt road, with the distant mesas rising up behind them like silent guardians. A general store, a saloon, a small church, and what must be the schoolhouse at the far end. Clara took a deep breath and began walking toward the heart of town, determined to find Mrs. Henderson, the mayor's wife who had hired her through correspondence. She hadn't taken more than 10 steps when she noticed the women. 3 of them stood outside the general store, their heads close together as they watched her approach. Unlike Clara in her impractical dress, these women wore practical calico, their hands rough from work, their faces weathered by sun and wind. As Clara drew nearer, she heard their whispers. "Would you look at that getup? Probably thinks she's going to a fancy tea party. City girl won't last a week out here." One of the women, a redhead with freckles scattered across her nose, made no effort to lower her voice. "That dress looks like something my grandmother would wear to church if my grandmother had gone blind first." The women snickered, their laughter cutting through Clara like a knife. She felt her cheeks burn, but she held her head high. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "Not today, not when everything depended on making a good impression." "Pardon me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm looking for Mrs. Henderson." The women exchanged glances, and the redhead pointed toward the far end of the street. "Last house on the left." "Can't miss it, it's the only one with curtains." Another round of laughter followed. Clara nodded her thanks and continued walking, dignity intact but spirits sinking. Perhaps she had made a terrible mistake coming here. Perhaps, don't mind them, a deep voice called from behind her. Frontier hospitality takes some getting used to. Clara turned to find a man leading a chestnut horse from the direction of the livery stable. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a strong jawline softened by the hint of a smile. His dark hair curled beneath the brim of his Stetson, and his eyes, a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin, regarded her with unexpected kindness. "I'm Will Rogers," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Town Marshal, you must be Miss Wilson, our new schoolteacher." "Clara Wilson," she confirmed, surprised that news of her arrival had spread so quickly. "How did you know? Small town," he said with a shrug. "News travels faster than the wind. That and Mrs. Henderson's been talking about nothing else for weeks. First proper schoolteacher Glenrio's ever had." Clara was about to respond when she heard more snickering from the women, who were still watching her. She unconsciously smoothed her dress again, feeling foolish and out of place. Will Rogers followed her gaze, his expression hardening slightly as he took in the gossiping women. Then he looked back at Clara, his eyes warm with something that might have been admiration. "You look beautiful to me," he said simply, as if stating an obvious fact. "And more importantly, you look like someone who might actually teach our children something worth knowing." The unexpected compliment caught Clara off guard. No one had called her beautiful since Richard had left her standing alone at the altar 6 months ago. The memory of that day still stung, but something in the Marshal's straightforward gaze helped ease the pain. "Thank you, Marshal Rogers," she said. "I hope I can live up to the town's expectations." "Will," he corrected. "Just will, and I suspect you'll do more than live up to them. You'll probably exceed them." He glanced at her trunk. "Let me help you with that, Mrs. Henderson's is a fair walk from here." Before she could protest, he had handed his horse's reins to a passing boy with instructions to take the animal to the livery, then lifted her trunk as if it weighed nothing. Clara found herself walking beside the Marshal, her carpet bag clutched in her hands, suddenly aware of how the women had fallen silent, watching them with undisguised curiosity. "Is it always this hot?" Clara asked, desperate to fill the silence with something other than the pounding of her heart. Will laughed, the sound rich and genuine. This is nothing. Wait until August." "Wonderful," Clara murmured, already feeling the perspiration beading on her forehead. Her dress, designed for Philadelphia's genteel drawing rooms, was suffocating in the New Mexico heat. "You'll adjust," Will said. "Everyone does eventually." He glanced sideways at her. "Though you might want to consider more practical attire. The ladies at the general store sell fabric better suited to our climate." Clara nodded, thinking of the few dresses packed in her trunk. None of them were any more suitable than the one she wore. "I'll need to economize until my first payment, but yes, that seems wise." They walked in companionable silence for a moment before Will spoke again. "So, what brings a lady like you all the way from the East?" "Most folks have a story when they come this far west." Clara hesitated. "A fresh start," she said finally. "Isn't that why most people come west?" Will's expression told her he knew there was more to it, but he didn't press. "Fair enough, we all have pasts. Out here, it's what you do going forward that matters." They reached a small but well-maintained house at the end of the street. A woman with silver-streaked hair stood on the porch, her round face breaking into a smile when she spotted them. "Miss Wilson, at last," she called, hurrying down the steps. "And I see our Marshal has taken it upon himself to be your welcoming committee." "Just offering some assistance, Mrs. Henderson," Will said, setting down the trunk. "Seemed the neighborly thing to do." Mrs. Henderson beamed. "Well, you've done your duty, Marshal. I'll take care of our new schoolteacher now." She took Clara's arm. "Come inside, dear. You must be parched after your journey. I've got fresh lemonade waiting." Clara turned to thank Will, but he was already tipping his hat. "Welcome to Glenrio, Miss Wilson," he said. "I look forward to seeing what you make of our little town." With that, he turned and walked back toward the center of town, his stride long and confident. "He's a good man, our Marshal," Mrs. Henderson said, following Clara's gaze. "Too serious for his own good sometimes, but a good man. Now let's get you settled." Clara allowed herself to be led inside, but her thoughts lingered on Will Rogers and his unexpected kindness. Perhaps Glenrio would offer her the fresh start she so desperately needed after all. Mrs. Henderson's home was modest but comfortable, with actual wallpaper and polished furniture that spoke of a life transported from somewhere east. Clara sat at the kitchen table, gratefully accepting a glass of lemonade that tasted like heaven after her dusty journey. "Now then, Mrs. Henderson said, settling across from her. "I imagine you've noticed we're not exactly Boston or Philadelphia out here," Clara smiled. "I was warned in your letters that frontier life would be an adjustment." "An adjustment," Mrs. Henderson laughed. "That's one way of putting it. But you'll find most folks here are decent, hard-working people. They may seem rough around the edges, but they value education for their children, which is why we scraped together enough funds to build the schoolhouse and hire you." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "I won't lie to you, Miss Wilson. Not everyone was in favor of spending money on a fancy Eastern teacher. Some thought any local woman could teach reading and figures well enough. You'll need to prove yourself." "I understand," Clara said, straightening her shoulders. "And I intend to do just that." "Good." Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly. "The schoolhouse isn't much, but we've done our best. Classes start Monday, which gives you 4 days to prepare. There are about 20 children, ages 6 to 16. Some can only attend sporadically, especially during planting and harvest." She continued explaining the particulars while Clara finished her lemonade. The living arrangements were simple. Clara would have a small room attached to the schoolhouse itself, sparsely furnished but private. Meals would be her own responsibility, though many families would likely invite her to dinner, at least initially. As for those harpies you met on your arrival, Mrs. Henderson said with a sniff, pay them no mind. Mabel Turner, Sarah Johnson, and Betty Miller fancy themselves the arbiters of taste in Glenrio, which is laughable considering none of them has been east of the Mississippi. Clara managed a smile. The Marshal Mr. Rogers was kind enough to intervene. Was he now, Mrs. Henderson's eyes twinkled. Interesting, our Marshal typically keeps to himself, especially where new ladies are concerned, ever since, she stopped abruptly. Well, never mind about that. Let's get you over to the schoolhouse and show you your new home. Clara wanted to ask what Mrs. Henderson had been about to say regarding Will, but she held her tongue. She would learn the town's secrets soon enough. The schoolhouse stood at the outskirts of town, a simple wooden structure with a small bell tower. Inside was a single large room with rows of rough-hewn benches and desks, a larger desk at the front for the teacher, and a blackboard mounted on the wall. Windows lined both sides, providing ample light. A door at the back led to Clara's quarters, one room containing a narrow bed, a washstand, a small table with 2 chairs, and a tiny stove for cooking and heat. It's not much, Mrs. Henderson said apologetically. It's perfect, Clara replied, and she meant it. The room was clean and private, more than she'd dared hope for. After the humiliation she'd endured in Philadelphia, even this simple space represented freedom and independence. Mrs. Henderson helped her unpack and get settled, explaining where she could purchase supplies and which families had children attending the school. By the time she left, promising to return in the morning to show Clara around town properly, shadows had lengthened across the floor, and Clara was exhausted. She sat on the edge of her bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a frontier evening, distant cattle lowing, the occasional burst of laughter from the direction of the saloon, the cry of some bird she couldn't identify. So different from Philadelphia's ceaseless urban noise. Clara had just begun preparing for bed when a knock at the door startled her. Cautiously, she approached the door. "Who is it?" "Will Rogers, Miss Wilson. Brought you some supper. Figured you might be too tired to cook tonight." Surprised, Clara opened the door to find the Marshal standing there with a cloth-covered basket. "That's very thoughtful of you, Marshal." "Will," he corrected again, handing her the basket. "Mrs. Rodriguez at the cafe heard you'd arrived. She insisted on sending over her famous chicken stew. Best in the territory, she claims, though I've never found reason to doubt her." The delicious aroma wafting from the basket made Clara's stomach rumble embarrassingly. She hadn't realized how hungry she was. "Please thank Mrs. Rodriguez for me, would you? Would you like to join me?" "There seems to be plenty." Will hesitated, and for a moment Clara thought he would accept. Then he shook his head. "Better not. Already plenty of talk in town about the new schoolteacher. No sense adding fuel to the gossip fire on your first day." He tipped his hat. "Good night, Miss Wilson. I'll check in on you tomorrow." Before she could respond, he turned and disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Clara with the warm basket and the distinct feeling that there was much more to Marshal Will Rogers than met the eye. The next morning, Clara woke to sunlight streaming through her small window and the distant sound of a rooster crowing. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came flooding back: the stagecoach, the snickering women, the kind Marshal, her new life in Glenrio. She dressed carefully in one of her better dresses, still woefully inappropriate for frontier life, but the best she had, and set about exploring her schoolroom more thoroughly. The books were few and well-worn, McGuffey's readers, a few arithmetic primers, an atlas at least 10 years out of date, and a battered copy of the Bible. Clara made notes of what else she would need, determined to create a proper educational environment despite the limited resources. Mrs. Henderson arrived mid-morning as promised, and they set off to tour Glenrio properly. In daylight, Clara could see that the town was larger than she had initially thought, with scattered homes and small farms stretching beyond the main street. The general store, run by Mr. and Mrs. Parker, was surprisingly well stocked. Clara purchased pencils, paper, and a few other essentials for the classroom, carefully counting out her dwindling funds. You'll need fabric for new dresses, Mrs. Henderson said, eyeing Clara's impractical attire. Something sturdy and practical. Clara sighed. I'm afraid that we'll have to wait until my first month's salary. Mrs. Parker, a kindly woman with spectacles perched on her nose, overheard. Nonsense, dear. We can work out an arrangement. Perhaps you could tutor our Emmeline in the evenings. She struggles with her letters, something fierce, and my husband has his heart set on her being able to help with the bookkeeping someday. Relieved, Clara agreed to the arrangement. She selected several yards of sturdy cotton in practical colors, along with thread and buttons. As she was examining the fabrics, the bell above the store door jingled, and the three women who had mocked her the previous day entered. The redhead Mabel Turner, according to Mrs. Henderson's earlier identification, stopped short when she saw Clara. Her companions, Sarah and Betty, exchanged glances before plastering false smiles on their faces. Why, Miss Wilson, settling in already? Mabel's saccharine tone couldn't disguise the malice beneath. I see you're buying fabric. Smart decision. That dress you were wearing yesterday looked about as suited to Glenrio as a fish to the desert. Clara felt her cheeks burn but kept her composure. Mrs. Parker was kind enough to suggest an arrangement. I'll be tutoring her daughter in exchange. How? Resourceful, Sarah said with a smirk. Though I'm not sure what you Easterners could teach us about surviving out here. Reading, writing, arithmetic, Clara replied evenly, the same valuable skills taught in schools across the country. She gathered her purchases. If you'll excuse me, I have a classroom to prepare. I look forward to meeting your children on Monday. As she turned to leave, Betty called after her, My Thomas says he's too old for schooling. 15's a man out here, not a boy to be taught by some city girl. Clara paused at the door. Education has no age limit, Mrs. Miller. Your son is welcome in my classroom for as long as he wishes to learn. With that, she stepped outside, her heart pounding. Mrs. Henderson, who had been speaking with Mr. Parker, hurried after her. Well handled, she said approvingly. Those three have been terrors since their husbands struck silver in their claim last year. Suddenly they think they're aristocracy, she snorted. As if money could buy breeding. They continued their tour, meeting the town doctor, the Reverend and his wife, and several other prominent citizens. Clara was introduced as our new schoolteacher from Philadelphia, and she endured the curious stares and polite questions with as much grace as she could muster. By mid-afternoon, Clara was exhausted from the social interactions and the relentless sun. Mrs. Henderson must have noticed, for she suggested they return to the schoolhouse. You've met enough people for one day, she said kindly. The rest can wait until Sunday service. As they walked back, Clara spotted Will Rogers on horseback at the edge of town, speaking with a weathered-looking man. The marshal noticed her and raised his hand in greeting before returning to his conversation. That's old Jim Taylor, Mrs. Henderson explained. Runs cattle north of town. Decent sort, though his wife's another gossip to watch out for. Clara nodded, her eyes lingering on Will. In daylight, his presence was even more commanding, broad-shouldered and straight-backed, with a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from him. She wondered what had brought him to Glenrio and what had made him stay. Back at the schoolhouse, Clara spent the remainder of the day organizing her meager supplies and planning lessons. She had just started preparing a simple supper when another knock came at her door. This time, she wasn't entirely surprised to find Will Rogers standing there, though she hadn't expected the burlap sack he carried. Evening, Miss Wilson, he said. Thought you might appreciate some fresh vegetables from my garden. Nothing fancy, just some potatoes, carrots, and a few tomatoes. Clara accepted the sack gratefully. You have a garden. I wouldn't have thought a town marshal would have time for such pursuits. Will smiled, and Clara was struck by how it transformed his face, softening the lines around his eyes. Man can't live on keeping the peace alone. Besides, tending plants gives me time to think. He glanced past her to where her pathetic attempt at a meal sat half-prepared on the small table. Learning your way around that stove, Clara laughed. I'm afraid cooking wasn't part of my education at Miss Beaumont's Academy for Young Ladies. We were taught to direct servants, not to be them. Servants? Will raised an eyebrow. Sounds like you came from more genteel circumstances than most who end up in Glenrio. Clara realized her mistake immediately. She hadn't meant to reveal anything about her past. That was before. Life changes. She changed the subject quickly. Would you like to come in? I can't promise the meal will be edible, but you're welcome to risk it. This time we'll actually laugh. Tempting, but I've got rounds to make. Perhaps another time when the town's had a chance to get used to you. He tipped his hat. Good night, Miss Wilson. As he walked away, Clara called after him. Clara, if I'm to call you Will, you should call me Clara. He turned, walking backward for a few steps. Clara then, sleep well. With a last nod, he continued on his way. Clara closed the door, clutching the sack of vegetables to her chest. What was it about Will Rogers that made her feel so seen? For months after Richard had abandoned her, she had felt invisible, diminished by shame and disappointment. But when Will looked at her with those clear blue eyes, she felt as though he was actually seeing her, not just the scandal-tainted woman who had fled east, but someone of value. Shaking off such fanciful thoughts, Clara turned her attention to preparing a proper meal from the bounty Will had provided. As she worked, she found herself humming a tune she hadn't sung in months. Perhaps Glenrio would be more than just an escape after all. Perhaps, just perhaps, it might become a home. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a sense of anticipation. Clara had spent the intervening days preparing her classroom, creating lesson plans, and sewing a new dress from the fabric she'd purchased. It was a simple design, practical yet flattering, with a skirt that wouldn't drag in the dust and a bodice that allowed for movement. She wore it proudly to church, determined to make a better second impression on the town. The small white church was packed when Clara arrived with Mrs. Henderson. It seemed the entire population of Glenrio and the surrounding homesteads had turned out, as much to see the new teacher as to worship. Clara felt their eyes on her as she walked down the aisle, but she held her head high, offering smiles to those she had already met and nods to those she hadn't. She was pleased to see that her new dress drew approving glances from several of the women, though Mabel Turner and her friends still watched with barely concealed disdain. Clara took a seat near the front, next to Mrs. Henderson, and turned her attention to the service. Reverend Cooper's sermon was mercifully brief, focusing on the value of education and the importance of supporting the new school, a pointed message that had several parents shifting uncomfortably in their seats. After the final hymn, he introduced Clara formally to the congregation, inviting her to say a few words. Standing before the crowd, Clara was suddenly nervous. These people would entrust their children to her care. They needed to believe in her. "Good morning," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "I'm honored to be Glenrio's new teacher. I believe education is the greatest gift we can give our children, not just learning to read and write, but learning to think critically and independently. I promise to do my best for each student who enters my classroom, and I look forward to working with all of you to build a school that serves this community's needs." Her simple speech was met with polite applause and a few enthusiastic amens from parents who clearly valued education. As people filed out of the church, many stopped to introduce themselves and their children. Clara made a point of kneeling down to speak directly to each child, learning names and asking about their interests. By the time the churchyard emptied, she had met most of her future students and felt cautiously optimistic about the next day's first class. Will Rogers had been conspicuously absent from the service when Clara mentioned this to Mrs. Henderson as they walked back toward town. The older woman sighed. "Will and God have been on uncertain terms since the war," she explained. "He served with the Union, saw things no man should see, came west afterward like so many veterans looking for a fresh start." Her expression turned sad. "Found some peace here for a while, even fell in love with Janet Miller, Betty's sister-in-law. They were engaged to be married." Clara felt an unexpected pang. "What happened? Influenza swept through 3 winters ago. Janet was one of 12 we lost. Will changed after that. Threw himself into his duties, rarely speaks of personal matters now." Mrs. Henderson patted Clara's arm. "Don't mistake his kindness toward you for anything more than basic decency. That man locked his heart away with Janet's memory." Clara nodded, telling herself that the hollow feeling in her chest was merely sympathy for Will's loss, not disappointment. "That's terribly sad. Life out here is hard," Mrs. Henderson said simply. We endure. They walked in silence for a moment before Mrs. Henderson changed the subject, asking about Clara's preparations for the next day's classes. Clara answered mechanically, her thoughts still on Will and the sorrow that must lie beneath his calm exterior. No wonder he seemed so serious, so controlled. He had built walls to protect himself from further pain. Clara could understand that all too well. Wasn't that what she'd done after Richard's betrayal? Built walls, fled west, determined never to be vulnerable again. Perhaps she and the Marshal had more in common than she'd realized. Monday dawned bright and clear, and Clara was at the schoolhouse before sunrise, arranging benches, placing the few books she had on the small shelf, and writing a welcome message on the blackboard. By 8 o'clock, children began arriving, some eagerly, others with obvious reluctance. Most were accompanied by mothers who eyed Clara with equal parts hope and skepticism. By 8:30, 18 students had arrived, ranging from 6-year-old Lucy Cooper, the minister's daughter, to 16-year-old Thomas Miller, who slouched in the back row with a defiant expression. Clara noted with satisfaction that despite his mother's claims, Betty Miller's son had indeed shown up. Clara rang the small bell that hung by the door, and the room gradually quieted. "Good morning," she said, smiling at each child in turn. "I'm Miss Wilson, and I'm delighted to be your teacher. We're going to learn a great deal together this year, but first, I'd like to learn about all of you." She proceeded with a simple getting-to-know-you exercise, having each child stand and share their name, age, and something they enjoyed doing. Some were shy, barely audible, others were boisterous and eager to talk. Thomas Miller remained stubbornly silent until Clara prompted him directly. "Reading," he finally muttered when asked what he enjoyed. "When there's time, which there ain't much." Clara saw an opening. "What do you like to read, Thomas?" He shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Adventure stories, about places that ain't here." "That aren't here," Clara corrected gently. "I have a few books you might enjoy. See me after class." She moved on quickly, not wanting to embarrass him further, but she'd seen the flicker of interest in his eyes. There was a mind in there hungry for knowledge, regardless of what his mother thought about 15 being a man out here. The morning progressed smoothly as Clara assessed her students' abilities, separating them into groups based on their reading and arithmetic skills rather than strictly by age. She assigned simple tasks to keep each group occupied while she worked with others, a strategy she'd developed during her teaching apprenticeship in Philadelphia. By noon, when the children were released for their midday meal, Clara was exhausted but exhilarated. Teaching was what she loved, what she was good at, and these children, despite their varied backgrounds and abilities, were eager to learn. Even Thomas had grudgingly completed his assignments, though he'd been the first to bolt when she dismissed them. Clara was eating her own simple lunch at her desk, reviewing her notes for the afternoon session, when the schoolhouse door opened and Will Rogers stepped inside. He removed his hat as he entered, revealing hair damp with sweat. "Miss Wilson," he greeted her. "Thought I'd check in, see how your first morning went." Clara smiled, genuinely pleased to see him. The children are wonderful, diverse in their abilities and backgrounds, but all eager in their own ways. Even Thomas Miller, Will asked with a knowing look. "Even Thomas," Clara confirmed. "He's putting on a show of reluctance, but there's a sharp mind there. I suspect he's read more than he lets on," Will nodded. "His father values education, but his mother," he shrugged. "Well, you've met Betty." "Indeed." Clara hesitated, then added, "I missed you at church yesterday." Will's expression closed slightly. "Sunday's my day for riding the outer boundaries of our township. Keeps trouble at bay." It was clearly an excuse, but Clara didn't press. After a brief silence, Will changed the subject. "I hear you made quite an impression with your new dress, Mrs. Henderson says half the women in town are already asking for the pattern." Clara laughed. "Hardly that many, I'm sure, but Mrs. Parker did compliment it. Amazing what a difference appropriate attire makes." "You looked fine before," Will said, a hint of defensiveness in his tone. "Don't let those women make you think otherwise." The unexpected fierceness in his voice warmed Clara. "Thank you, but they weren't entirely wrong. My Philadelphia dresses weren't suited to Glenrio's climate or lifestyle. This is an adaptation." Will studied her for a moment. "You adapt quickly." That's good. This place tests people, weeds out those who can't bend with the wind. And you, Clara asked, emboldened by his candor, have you bent or merely endured? Something flickered in Will's eyes, surprise, perhaps, at her directness. Both, I suppose, he answered after a pause. Lost some, gained some. That's life anywhere, but out here the lessons come harder and faster. Before Clara could respond, the schoolhouse door burst open again, and several children tumbled back in, energy renewed after their break. Will stepped back, nodding to Clara. I'll leave you to your students. Good day, Miss Wilson. Clara, she reminded him softly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Clara, he echoed before settling his hat back on his head and departing. The afternoon session went as smoothly as the morning, though Clara noticed Thomas Miller was unusually attentive when she discussed literature. When the final bell rang, he lingered while the other children rushed out, shuffling his feet awkwardly. You mentioned some books, he finally said, eyes fixed on the floor. Clara smiled. I did. She went to her desk and removed a worn copy of Treasure Island from her personal collection. It's a recent publication about pirates and buried treasure. I think you might enjoy it. Thomas took the book gingerly as if it might bite him. I'll be careful with it. I know you will, Clara said. Books are treasures themselves, aren't they? He nodded, a hint of a smile breaking through his sullen facade. Ma says reading's a waste of time for a boy my age. And what do you think? Clara asked. Thomas ran his fingers over the book's cover. I think there's a whole world out there I haven't seen. Books let me see it anyway. He glanced up at her, suddenly embarrassed by his honesty. Thanks, Miss Wilson. I'll return it quick as I can. Take your time, Clara assured him. There's no rush. After Thomas left, Clara sat at her desk, reflecting on her first day. It had gone better than she dared hope. The children were receptive, the parents for the most part supportive, and even the challenging students like Thomas showed promise. For the first time since arriving in Glenrio, Clara felt truly confident in her decision to come west. The next few weeks settled into a routine. Clara taught during the day, worked on her sewing in the evenings, and gradually became a familiar figure in Glenrio. She made a point of shopping at the general store, dining occasionally at Mrs. Rodriguez's cafe, and attending Sunday services regularly. Slowly, she began to feel less like an outsider and more like a community member. Will Rogers remained a constant, if somewhat distant, presence. He would stop by the schoolhouse every few days, ostensibly to check on safety or deliver vegetables from his garden, but Clara sensed he enjoyed their conversations. They spoke of books they'd read, local events, and the progress of her students. Will never mentioned his past or Janet Miller, and Clara never asked, though Mrs. Henderson's revelations helped her understand the shadows that sometimes crossed his face. Clara was equally guarded about her own history. When questions about Philadelphia arose, she deflected them with vague references to family circumstances that had prompted her move west. Most people were too polite to pry further, though Mabel Turner and her friends continued to speculate loudly whenever Clara was within earshot. Probably ran away from a scandal, Clara overheard Betty Miller saying one afternoon at the general store. Decent women don't travel across the country alone unless they're running from something. Clara had pretended not to hear, but the words stung because they contained a grain of truth. She was running from humiliation, from gossip, from the pitying glances of people who had once been friends. The specifics might differ from Glenrio's speculation, but the essence was the same. One evening in late September, Clara was walking back from Mrs. Parker's house where she'd been tutoring young Emmeline when she heard rapid hoofbeats approaching. She stepped aside to let the rider pass, but to her surprise, the horse slowed beside her. It was Will, looking unusually grim. Clara, he said, dismounting quickly. I was just coming to find you. There's trouble, her heart quickened. What kind of trouble? Fire at the Matthews place about 2 miles north. Barns burning, and it could spread to the house. I'm gathering men to help. Thought you might assist Mrs. Matthews with the children, they're pretty shaken up. Without hesitation, Clara nodded. Of course. Let me get my shawl from the schoolhouse and I'll be ready. 10 minutes later, she was riding behind Will on his horse, arms wrapped tightly around his waist as they galloped toward the Matthews homestead. She could see the glow of flames against the darkening sky before they even crested the final hill. The scene that greeted them was chaotic men forming a bucket brigade from the well to the burning barn, women hurrying to remove valuables from the nearby house, and children crying as they watched their home threatened. Clara slid from the horse before Will had fully stopped, hurrying toward where Mrs. Matthews stood with her 4 children, the youngest still in arms. "Mrs. Matthews, I'm Clara Wilson, the school teacher," she introduced herself. "I've come to help with the children while you see to your home." The exhausted woman looked at Clara with gratitude. "Bless you, Miss Wilson. I've been trying to keep them calm, but with John fighting the fire and everything in chaos." She handed the baby to Clara without further prompting. For the next hour, Clara sat with the Matthews children under a large oak tree a safe distance from the fire, telling stories and singing songs to distract them from the drama unfolding. From her vantage point, she could see Will working alongside the other men, passing buckets, and at one point rushing into the smoke-filled barn to help free a panicked horse that had been left inside. By midnight, the fire was contained, though the barn was a complete loss. The house had been spared, and miraculously, no people or livestock had been seriously injured. Clara, still holding the sleeping Matthews baby, watched as Will approached, his face streaked with soot, clothes singed in places. "You're hurt," she said, noticing a burn on his forearm where his rolled-up sleeve had exposed skin. Will glanced down as if noticing the injury for the first time. "It's nothing. Mrs. Matthews okay, exhausted and worried about the loss of the barn, but she's inside resting now." The children finally fell asleep. Clara shifted the baby slightly. "You were brave going into the barn like that," Will shrugged. "Did what needed doing. We all did." He looked at her, a new respect in his eyes, "including you." Not many Eastern ladies would have ridden out to a fire in the middle of the night to care for someone else's children. "I'm not many Eastern ladies," Clara said simply. "No," Will agreed softly. "You certainly are not." Their eyes held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then the baby stirred in Clara's arms, breaking the spell. Will cleared his throat. "We should get you back to town. You have school in the morning." The ride back was quiet, both of them tired from the night's events. Clara found herself leaning against Will's back, drawing comfort from his solid presence. When they reached the schoolhouse, Will insisted on seeing her to her door. "Thank you," Clara said, turning to face him in the moonlight, "for including me tonight, for letting me help." Will studied her face. "You're becoming part of Glenrio, Clara Wilson, whether you plan to or not." The words filled her with unexpected warmth. "I think perhaps I am." Will reached out, hesitated, then gently brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek. His touch was light, tentative, but it sent a current through Clara that had nothing to do with fear or danger. For a heartbeat, she thought he might lean closer, might do what his eyes suggested he was considering. Instead, he stepped back, hand falling to his side. "Good night, Clara. Sleep well." As Clara watched him walk away, she realized with startling clarity that she was in dangerous territory. She was developing feelings for Will Rogers, feelings that went far beyond friendship or gratitude. Feelings she had sworn never to indulge again after Richard's betrayal. She closed her door and leaned against it, heart racing. This wasn't part of her plan. She had come to Glenrio to escape the past and build a new future, a future centered on her teaching, her independence. There was no room in that plan for falling in love with a man still haunted by the ghost of his lost fiancé. And yet, as she prepared for bed, Clara couldn't forget the look in Will's eyes when he'd touched her face, or the way her heart had leaped in response. Despite her best intentions, despite the walls she'd built, Clara Wilson was falling in love with the Marshal of Glenrio. October brought cooler temperatures and the annual Harvest Festival, a tradition that brought together not only the residents of Glenrio, but also families from surrounding homesteads and neighboring towns. The festival was to be held in the town square on the second Saturday of the month, and preparations had been underway for weeks. Clara's students were beside themselves with excitement. The school would have a booth displaying their work, and several of the older children would perform recitations or musical pieces for the gathered crowd. Clara had spent extra hours helping them prepare, determined that her first public showcase as Glenrio's teacher would be impressive. The morning of the festival dawned clear and crisp. Clara dressed carefully in her newest creation, a russet-colored dress with practical leather boots that Mrs. Parker had helped her order from a catalog. She had grown quite skilled at frontier dressmaking over the past months and took pride in her transformed wardrobe, which now suited both her position and her environment. The town square was already bustling when she arrived to set up the school's booth. Colorful bunting decorated the buildings. Tables laden with food lined one side of the square, and a wooden platform had been constructed for the various performances scheduled throughout the day. The atmosphere was festive, with children running excitedly between displays and adults greeting neighbors they might not have seen in weeks. Clara was arranging her students' writing samples when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "You've done wonders with these children in such a short time." She turned to find Will, dressed more formally than she'd ever seen him, in a clean shirt, polished boots, and his best Stetson. He was freshly shaved, and his dark hair had been neatly trimmed. The sight of him made Clara's heart skip a beat. "Thank you," she said, hoping her voice sounded more composed than she felt. "They're eager learners, for the most part. Even Thomas Miller has been improving steadily." Will smiled. "So I've heard. Betty's been complaining that he spends all his free time with his nose in a book now." His expression grew more serious. "You've made a real difference here, Clara. People are noticing." "Even Mabel Turner and her friends?" Clara asked skeptically. Will laughed. "Well, perhaps not everyone, but the ones who matter." He gestured toward the booth. "Need any help setting up?" Together they arranged the children's artwork, writing samples, and simple science projects. As they worked, Clara was acutely aware of Will's proximity, the occasional brush of his hand against hers, the scent of soap and leather that seemed uniquely his. She had seen little of him since the night of the Matthews fire, both of them busy with their respective duties, but her feelings had only deepened in the interim. By midday, the festival was in full swing. Clara's students performed admirably, earning enthusiastic applause from the crowd. Even Thomas Miller, initially reluctant to participate, delivered a moving recitation from The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere that had his mother looking on with grudging pride. After the performances, Clara found herself surrounded by parents offering congratulations and thanks. She accepted their praise graciously, insisting that the children deserved the credit for their hard work. When the crowd finally dispersed, she spotted Mabel Turner and her friends watching from nearby, their expressions less hostile than usual. Emboldened by the day's success, Clara approached them. "Good afternoon, ladies. I hope you're enjoying the festival." There was an awkward pause before Sarah Johnson responded. "The children performed well. You've clearly been working hard with them." Coming from Sarah, this was high praise indeed. Clara smiled. "Thank you, they're wonderful students." Betty Miller cleared her throat. "Thomas has been different lately, more focused. John says he's even been helping with the accounts for our silver claim." She looked as if the admission pained her. Perhaps book learning isn't entirely useless for a boy his age. Clara kept her expression neutral, though inside she was rejoicing at this small victory. "Thomas has a fine mind. I believe he could go on to college someday, if that's something you and Mr. Miller would consider." Betty looked startled at the suggestion, but she didn't immediately dismiss it. "We'll see," was all she said before the three women moved away, but Clara counted even that as progress. As the afternoon continued, the festival took on a more relaxed atmosphere. Tables were cleared to create space for dancing, and a small band of local musicians began playing lively tunes. Clara watched from the sidelines as couples twirled and stomped, the music growing increasingly spirited as the sun began its descent. "Would you care to dance?" Will's voice beside her made Clara start. She hadn't seen him approach. I don't know the steps," she admitted. Philadelphia dances were somewhat more formal. Will's eyes twinkled. "Nothing to it, just follow my lead." Before she could protest further, he had taken her hand and led her into the cleared space. The music was a lively reel, and Clara found herself being guided through unfamiliar steps that had her breathless with exertion and laughter. Will was surprisingly graceful for such a tall man, and his hand on her waist steadied her whenever she faltered. As the music ended, applause broke out, and Clara realized they had drawn an audience. She blushed, suddenly aware of how intimate the dance had felt despite its public nature. Will, seeming to sense her discomfort, led her away from the dancing area toward the refreshment table, where he handed her a cup of Mrs. Henderson's famous apple cider. "You're a natural," he said, for someone who claimed not to know the steps. Clara sipped the cider, grateful for the chance to compose herself. "I had an excellent partner," Will's expression softened. "It's good to see you enjoying yourself, Clara. You've been working so hard with the school, sometimes I wonder if you allow yourself any pleasure at all." "Teaching is my pleasure," Clara replied automatically, then realized how prim she sounded. "But yes, today has been wonderful, I feel." She searched for the right word. "I feel at home here." Will studied her over the rim of his cup. "Enough to stay, beyond your one-year contract, I mean." The question caught Clara off guard. She hadn't thought beyond the school year, hadn't dared to plan a future when she was still so focused on escaping her past. "I haven't decided," she said honestly. "There's much to consider," Will nodded, his expression unreadable. "Of course." "Plenty of time to think about it." He set down his empty cup. "Would you like to walk? It's getting a bit crowded here." They strolled away from the festival, toward the quiet end of town where the schoolhouse stood. The setting sun cast long shadows across the dirt street, and the sounds of music and laughter grew fainter as they walked. Clara was intensely aware of Will beside her, of the question he'd asked, and all the implications behind it. "I never expected to find peace here," she said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "When I left Philadelphia, I was simply running away. I didn't think about what I might be running toward." Will gave her a sidelong glance. "And what were you running from, Clara Wilson?" "If you don't mind my asking." Clara hesitated. She had kept her humiliation private for so long, but suddenly she wanted Will to know, wanted no secrets between them. "A broken engagement," she said quietly. "I was to be married to Richard Hargrove, son of one of Philadelphia's most prominent families. The wedding was planned, guests invited, my dress finished." Will waited silently as she gathered her thoughts. "The day before the wedding, Richard came to see me. He confessed that he'd been having an affair with my cousin Emily for months. They were in love, he said, but his family had pressed him to marry me because of my family's social standing." Clara's voice grew bitter. "He actually asked for my blessing to marry her instead, as if I should be happy for their true love." "Bastard," Will muttered. Clara smiled faintly at his protectiveness. "Indeed, I refused, of course, told him to go ahead with our wedding or face the scandal himself. It was petty and proud, but I was devastated," she sighed. "The next morning, he simply didn't appear at the church. 200 guests and no groom. The humiliation was complete." They had reached the schoolhouse now, and Clara paused at the steps, staring into the distance. "Emily married him 3 months later. My family, ashamed of the scandal, suggested I visit distant relatives until the gossip died down. Instead, I applied for teaching positions as far from Philadelphia as possible." Will was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Richard Hargrove was a fool." The simple statement, delivered with such conviction, made Clara's eyes sting with unexpected tears. "Thank you for saying so." "I'm not just saying it," Will insisted. "Any man who would give you up for another woman is a damned fool." The intensity in his voice made Clara look up, meeting his gaze directly. What she saw there, admiration, anger on her behalf, and something deeper, warmer, made her breath catch. "Will," she began, but he shook his head. "You should know," he said, voice low and urgent, "that not all men are like Richard Hargrove. Some of us know a treasure when we see one." Before Clara could respond, shouts erupted from the direction of the festival, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Will's posture changed instantly, alert and focused. "Stay here," he ordered, already turning back toward town. Clara ignored the instruction, gathering her skirts and following him. As they hurried back toward the square, the commotion grew louder. Rounding the corner, they found a scene of chaos, several men brawling in the center of the square, women and children backing away, the band silent, their instruments abandoned. Will waded into the fray without hesitation, pulling apart the two central combatants, John Miller and Jim Taylor, both red-faced and bloody-nosed. "That's enough," Will's commanding voice cut through the noise. "This is a family gathering, not a saloon brawl," he cheated me. John Miller shouted, struggling against Will's grip. "Claimed his cattle crossed onto my land by accident, but they've been grazing my best pasture for weeks. Your land was open range before you struck silver and decided to fence it," Jim Taylor retorted. "That pasture has been cattle country for 20 years. Will shoved them apart forcefully. "I said enough. Whatever the dispute, it can be settled tomorrow when you're both sober and civil. For now, the festival's over for both of you." He looked around at the gathered crowd. "Everyone else can continue enjoying themselves. Show's over." Reluctantly, the spectators began to disperse, returning to the dancing and refreshments. Will handed Jim Taylor off to his son with instructions to see him home, then turned his attention to John Miller, who was being berated by Betty. "Of all the foolish, embarrassing displays," she was saying, "fighting like common ruffians at a public gathering, what were you thinking?" Clara stepped forward. "Mrs. Miller, perhaps Thomas could help his father home. It seems Mr. Miller could use some rest." Betty looked as if she might argue, but Thomas was already at his father's side, supporting him with surprising strength for a boy his age. "Come on, Pa, let's get you home." As they walked away, Will turned to Clara with a mixture of exasperation and admiration. "I told you to stay at the schoolhouse." "You did," Clara agreed calmly. "I chose not to listen." Will ran a hand through his hair, disheveled from the scuffle. "You're not very good at taking directions, are you, Miss Wilson?" "Not when they're unreasonable ones, Marshal Rogers." She smiled to soften the words. "Besides, it seems the crisis is averted, no harm done," Will sighed. "For now, but this land dispute between Miller and Taylor has been brewing for months. It won't end here." He glanced around at the festival, which was slowly returning to its previous jovial atmosphere. "I should stay and keep an eye on things, make sure there's no more trouble." Clara nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. Their conversation had been interrupted at such a crucial moment. "Of course, that's your duty," Will hesitated, seeming torn. "Clara, about what I said before, it's all right," she interrupted, not wanting him to feel obligated. "We can talk another time." "No," Will said firmly. "I need you to know that I meant it, every word." He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I've been fighting this for months, telling myself it was too soon, that I wasn't ready. But the truth is, I care for you, Clara, more than I've cared for anyone since Janet." The confession, so unexpected yet so hoped for, left Clara momentarily speechless. Will mistook her silence for rejection and started to back away. "I understand if you don't feel the same way. After what you went through with Richard." "No," Clara said quickly, finding her voice. "That's not it at all." She took a deep breath. "I care for you too, Will, very much, but I feared you might still be unavailable." Understanding dawned in Will's eyes. "You know about Janet," Clara nodded. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned your engagement. I assumed your heart was still hers." Will's expression grew distant for a moment, then refocused on Clara with renewed clarity. "Janet will always have a place in my heart. I won't pretend otherwise, but I've learned that hearts can expand to hold new love without diminishing the old." He reached out to take her hand. "And what I feel for you, Clara Wilson, is definitely love." The world seemed to still around them, the sounds of the festival fading to a distant murmur. Clara looked into Will's eyes, those clear blue eyes that had seen so much sorrow yet still held such warmth, and knew with absolute certainty that this was real, this was true. This was nothing like what she'd had with Richard. "I love you too," she whispered, the words both terrifying and liberating. "God help me, I've tried not to, but I do." Will's smile was like the sunrise, slow and brilliant and full of promise. He leaned forward, and this time there was no hesitation as his lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle yet certain, a confirmation of words spoken and promises made. Clara's hands found his shoulders, steadying herself as the world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. When they parted, breathless and smiling, reality intruded in the form of a loud whoop from nearby. They turned to find several townspeople watching, including Mrs. Henderson, who looked smug, and Mabel Turner, whose expression hovered between shock and disapproval. Will laughed softly. "Well, that's done it. By tomorrow, the entire county will know that the marshal and the schoolteacher are courting." "Are we?" Clara asked, suddenly shy. Courting, I mean, Will raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. If you'll have me, Clara Wilson, I'd like nothing better. I'll have you, she replied without hesitation. Though I warn you, I'm still not very good at taking directions. Will's laughter echoed across the square, drawing more curious glances. I wouldn't have it any other way. As they walked back toward the festival, hand in hand, Clara felt a sense of completion she hadn't known was missing. She had come to Glenrio seeking escape and independence, never imagining she would find love instead. The women who had once snickered at her dress now watched with envy as she passed with Will Rogers at her side, his admiration evident in every glance. Glenrio was no longer just a hiding place. It was becoming home. The news of Clara and Will's courtship spread through Glenrio with predictable speed. By Monday morning, when Clara arrived at the schoolhouse, several of her students were already discussing it in hushed, excited whispers that fell silent as soon as she entered. "Good morning, children," she said brightly, pretending not to notice their knowing looks. "Let's begin with our arithmetic lesson today." Clara maintained her professional demeanor throughout the day, but she couldn't help the warmth that spread through her whenever she thought of Will's confession and her own. They had parted shortly after their kiss at the festival, both aware of the public scrutiny and Will's need to maintain order for the remainder of the evening. He had promised to call on her properly the following evening, and Clara found herself counting the hours. When the last student had departed for the day, Clara was surprised to find Betty Miller waiting outside the schoolhouse. The woman had been notably absent when Thomas arrived for school that morning, leading Clara to wonder if the events of the festival, both John Miller's brawl and her own public embrace with Will, had soured Betty's grudging acceptance. "Mrs. Miller," Clara greeted her cautiously. "What a pleasant surprise. Is everything all right with Thomas?" Betty looked uncomfortable, smoothing her skirts repeatedly. "Thomas is fine, thriving, in fact, thanks to your attention." She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "I've come to apologize, Miss Wilson." Of all the things Clara might have expected, an apology was not among them. "I beg your pardon for my behavior when you first arrived," Betty clarified. "The remarks about your dress, the snickering, the gossip, it was unworthy of me." She looked down, then met Clara's eyes directly. "Thomas told me what you said to him that first day when you lent him that book, about books being treasures. It's what his grandfather used to say." Clara remained silent, sensing there was more. "My father was a teacher," Betty continued, "back in Ohio before we came west. He believed in education, especially for girls, which wasn't common then. He taught me to read and cipher when other girls were only learning to keep house." Her expression softened with memory. "He died on the journey west. Cholera. I was 15, about Thomas's age now." "I'm so sorry," Clara said sincerely. Betty shook her head. "It was a long time ago, but I think I resented you when you arrived with your Eastern education and fancy dress. You reminded me of who I might have been if we'd never left Ohio if my father had lived." The confession was so unexpected, so human, that Clara was momentarily speechless. Finally, she said, "Thank you for telling me this, Mrs. Miller, and please know that there's nothing to apologize for. We all have our ghosts, our might have beens." Betty nodded, relief evident in her posture. "Well, that's all I came to say. Except," she hesitated, "except that Marshal Rogers is a good man, the best in these parts, if you ask me. Janet was my husband's sister, and her loss nearly destroyed him. I never thought I'd see him look at another woman the way he looked at you on Saturday." With that, Betty turned to leave, but Clara called after her. "Mrs. Miller, Betty, would you like to join me for tea sometime? I'd love to hear more about your father." Betty looked surprised, then genuinely pleased. "I'd like that, Miss Wilson, thank you." As Clara watched her go, she marveled at the unexpected turn of events. In the span of a weekend, her entire world had shifted on its axis. Will's declaration of love, her own acknowledgement of her feelings, and now this olive branch from one of her former tormentors. Glenrio was full of surprises. That evening, promptly at 6, a knock at her door announced Will's arrival. Clara had changed into her best dress, a deep blue creation that brought out the color in her eyes, and arranged her hair with extra care. She opened the door to find Will standing there, freshly bathed and shaved, holding a small bouquet of late wildflowers. "Good evening, Miss Wilson," he said formally, though his eyes danced with private amusement. "I've come to call if that's agreeable to you." Clara played along, dropping into a prim curtsy. "Good evening, Marshal Rogers. How kind of you to visit. Won't you come in?" They maintained the charade until the door closed behind him, then both burst into laughter. Will handed her the flowers with a grin. "I feel like a schoolboy again. Next thing you know, I'll be writing you notes asking if you like me." Clara accepted the bouquet, breathing in the sweet scent. "Well, do you like me, that is?" She kept her tone teasing, though her heart quickened. Will's expression grew serious. He stepped closer, cupping her face gently in his hands. "I more than like you, Clara Wilson. I love you. I think I have since the moment you stepped off that stagecoach in your impractical dress, head held high despite those women's snickering." Clara's breath caught at the tender honesty in his voice. "You barely knew me then." "I knew enough," Will insisted. "I saw your courage, your dignity. Everything I've learned about you since has only confirmed what I suspected that day, that you were someone special, someone rare." He leaned down to kiss her, and Clara melted into his embrace, the wildflowers crushed slightly between them. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, more certain, a promise rather than a question. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "I should probably offer you some tea," Clara murmured, her forehead resting against his chest. "That would be the proper thing to do during a formal call." Will laughed softly, his arms still around her. "I've never been particularly concerned with propriety." "Nor I, it seems," Clara admitted, stepping back reluctantly. "But perhaps we should make some attempt, given our positions in the community." Tea, Marshal Rogers. Will allowed her to lead him to her small table, where she had already prepared a modest meal: fresh bread, cheese, and the last of the tomatoes from Will's garden. They talked as they ate, sharing stories and hopes, learning each other more deeply. Clara told Will about her childhood in Philadelphia, her parents' expectations, and her decision to become a teacher despite their objections. Will spoke of his time in the Union Army, his journey west after the war, and his unexpected settling in Glenrio when he had intended only to pass through. "I was on my way to California," he explained. "Had it in my head that I'd try my luck in the gold fields. The stagecoach stopped here for a night, and there was trouble, a couple of drunk cowboys shooting up the place. The previous marshal had just quit, heading back east, and no one was stepping up. I helped restore order, and the next morning the town council offered me the job." He shrugged. "Seemed as good a place as any to put down roots." "And then you met Janet," Clara said softly. Will nodded, his expression reflective but not pained. "About a year later, she was visiting from Santa Fe, staying with her brother John and Betty, beautiful, spirited woman." He smiled at the memory. "We courted for 6 months before I proposed. We were to be married that spring, but the influenza came through that winter." Clara reached across the table to take his hand. "I'm so sorry, Will. For a long time I was just empty," Will continued. "Did my job, ate, slept, but not much more." It was as if all the color had leached out of the world. His grip on her hand tightened. "Then this Eastern schoolteacher arrived in an impractical blue dress, and suddenly I started seeing color again." The simple statement moved Clara deeply. "Oh, Will, I fought it," he admitted. "Felt disloyal to Janet's memory. But then I realized that she, of all people, would have been the first to tell me to live again, to love again." Clara brought his hand to her cheek, overwhelmed by the gift he was offering her, not just his love, but his trust, his willingness to risk pain again. "I will do my best to be worthy of that love," she promised. Will's eyes were suspiciously bright in the lamplight. "You already are." Their courtship progressed steadily through the autumn months. Will called on Clara regularly, escorted her to church on Sundays, and often joined her for supper at her small quarters. They were careful to maintain propriety. Will never stayed past a respectable hour, and they were never alone behind closed doors for too long. Glenrio might be a frontier town, but certain standards were still observed, particularly for the marshal and the schoolteacher. To Clara's surprise, her relationship with Mabel Turner and her friends gradually improved. Betty Miller's change of heart seemed to have influenced the others, or perhaps they simply recognized the inevitability of Clara's place in their community. By Thanksgiving, Clara found herself invited to Sarah Johnson's home for the holiday feast, along with Will and several other prominent citizens. The meal was sumptuous by frontier standards, a wild turkey shot by Mr. Johnson, vegetables from various root cellars, and pies made from preserved summer fruits. Clara sat beside Will, acutely aware of his presence even as she conversed with those around her. Occasionally, his hand would find hers beneath the table, a secret touch that sent warmth through her entire body. After the meal, while the men retired to the porch to smoke and the women cleared the dishes, Mabel approached Clara with an unexpected request. "Miss Wilson, Clara, I wonder if you might consider offering evening classes for adults," she said, her usual hauteur softened. "Some of us didn't have the educational opportunities you did, and well. I've been embarrassed more than once when traveling to Santa Fe, not knowing things that seem common knowledge to others." Clara was careful to keep her surprise from showing. "I would be delighted to organize adult classes, Mabel. What subjects would interest you most?" By the time the dishes were done, Clara had a list of potential adult students and subjects ranging from literature to basic accounting. She shared the news with Will as they walked back to her quarters in the crisp night air. Mabel Turner asking for education, Will marveled. "You've worked miracles in this town, Clara Wilson," Clara laughed. "Hardly miracles, just persistence. People want to learn, want to improve themselves. Sometimes they just need permission to admit it." Will stopped walking, turning to face her in the moonlight. His expression was so tender that Clara's breath caught. "Have I told you today that I love you?" "Not since this morning," she teased, though the words still gave her a thrill each time she heard them. "Well then, I'm overdue." Will took both her hands in his. "I love you, Clara Wilson. And I want to marry you." Clara's heart seemed to stop, then race forward. "Will, I know it's sudden," he continued quickly. "And if you need time to consider, I understand, but I wanted you to know my intentions. I want a life with you, Clara. A home, a family, all of it." Tears sprang to Clara's eyes. 6 months ago, she had been jilted, humiliated, running from her past. Now she stood beneath a New Mexico moon with a man offering her everything she had once thought forever lost to her. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Will Rogers, I will marry you." Will's face broke into a radiant smile. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her in a circle as she laughed with pure joy. When he set her down, he kissed her with a passion that left her dizzy. "When?" he asked against her lips. "Soon, I hope," Clara laughed. "Let me finish the school term." "That's only 6 more weeks. Then we can marry during the Christmas break." 6 weeks, Will groaned. "That's an eternity." "It will pass quickly," Clara assured him, "and then we'll have the rest of our lives." The rest of their lives. The phrase echoed in Clara's mind as Will walked her the remaining distance to her door. She had come to Glenrio seeking refuge, not permanence. Yet somehow, this dusty frontier town had become more than a hiding place, it had become her future. News of their engagement spread quickly, met with general approval and a few good-natured wagers about how long the courtship had been going on behind closed doors. Clara weathered the teasing with grace, too happy to be bothered by small-town gossip. The weeks leading up to Christmas were filled with preparations, both for the end of the school term and for the wedding. Clara wrote to her parents, informing them of her engagement and inviting them to the ceremony, though she doubted they would make the journey. Their few letters since her departure had been cool and formal, their disappointment in her rash decision to move west still evident. To her surprise, a telegram arrived 2 weeks before the wedding date. "Will attend wedding stop arriving December 20. Stop mother and father." Clara shared the news with Will that evening as they sat by her small stove, planning their future. "They're coming," she said, still stunned. "My parents are actually coming to Glenrio." Will squeezed her hand. "Are you pleased?" "I think so," Clara said slowly. "I've missed them despite our differences, but I'm also nervous. They're very proper, very Eastern. Glenrio will be a shock." "As will their daughter's transformation," Will pointed out with a smile, gesturing to Clara's practical frontier attire. "The Philadelphia debutante has become quite the Western woman," Clara laughed. "Indeed she has, and she's much happier for it." She leaned against Will's solid warmth. "Just promise you'll stand by me if they try to talk me into returning east." Will's arm tightened around her. Nothing could take you from me now, Clara Wilson, not even Philadelphia society. The day of her parents' arrival dawned clear and cold. Clara had arranged for them to stay with Mrs. Henderson, whose house was the most comfortable in town and had spent the previous day helping prepare the guest room. Now she stood at the stage coach stop, Will beside her, watching anxiously as the coach approached in a cloud of dust. "Breathe," Will murmured, squeezing her hand. "They're just people, Clara. People with very high standards and strong opinions," Clara whispered back, but she straightened her shoulders, determined to show her parents the confident, independent woman she had become. The coach rolled to a stop, and after a moment, a distinguished-looking man in an expensive travel coat stepped down, turning to assist a woman in an equally fine but dust-covered traveling ensemble. Clara hardly recognized them. At first they seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating than in her memory. "Mother, father," she called, stepping forward. Mrs. Wilson's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Clara, oh my dear girl." She rushed forward to embrace her daughter, propriety forgotten in the joy of reunion. Mr. Wilson followed more sedately, but his eyes were suspiciously bright as he took in his daughter's appearance. "You look well," he said simply. "Healthy, happy." "I am, father," Clara confirmed, turning to gesture Will forward. "May I present Marshal William Rogers, my fiancé? Will, these are my parents, Edward and Margaret Wilson." Will stepped forward, extending his hand to Mr. Wilson. "Sir, it's an honor to meet you." "Your daughter has spoken of you often." Mr. Wilson shook Will's hand, assessing him with a father's critical eye. "Marshal, is it? Law enforcement seems a dangerous profession in these territories." "It has its moments," Will acknowledged, "but Glenrio is generally peaceful." "We're fortunate in that regard." Mrs. Wilson was studying Will just as intently. "And how did you and our daughter meet, Marshal Rogers?" Clara intervened before Will could respond. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable. You must be exhausted after your journey." She guided her parents to Mrs. Henderson's house, where introductions were made and refreshments offered. Throughout the afternoon, Clara watched her parents gradually relax as they were welcomed by the community. Mrs. Henderson, perceptive as always, steered the conversation toward familiar topics whenever tension arose. And by evening, even Mr. Wilson was laughing at the reverend stories of frontier mishaps. Later, after her parents had retired to their room, Clara and Will sat on Mrs. Henderson's porch, enjoying a moment of quiet. "They're adjusting better than I expected," Clara admitted, "though I'm sure they still have reservations." Will nodded. "Your father questioned me quite thoroughly about my prospects while you were helping your mother settle in. Wanted to know if I owned property, had savings, could provide for you properly." Clara groaned. "I'm sorry, Will, they're from a different world." "Don't be sorry," Will said, taking her hand. "He's your father. He wants to ensure your security and happiness. I respect that." He smiled. "Besides, I was able to inform him that I do indeed own property, my house and the land it sits on, plus a small investment in the general store. I think he was surprised." "As am I," Clara admitted. "You never mentioned an investment in the store," Will shrugged. "Never came up." "But yes, I helped the Parkers expand last year when a shipment of goods was delayed and they were in a tight spot. They offered me a small partnership in return." Clara marveled at how there was still so much to learn about this man she was about to marry. "Any other secrets, Marshal Rogers?" Will's eyes twinkled. "Nothing significant, though I should probably mention that my house is somewhat larger than your current accommodations. 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, even a small study that would make an excellent nursery someday." He watched her face carefully. "If that's something you might want," Clara's heart swelled with emotion. "A family with you, it's everything I want, Will." The days before the wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparation and celebration. Clara was touched by how the entire town seemed involved in the planning. Mrs. Rodriguez and her daughters prepared the wedding feast, the schoolchildren created decorations, and even Mabel Turner contributed by organizing the church flowers. Most surprising was her parents' gradual warming to Glenrio and its inhabitants. Mr. Wilson spent hours with Will, discussing everything from local politics to cattle breeding, while Mrs. Wilson found unexpected common ground with Betty Miller over quilting techniques. By the day before the wedding, they seemed almost reluctant to return east. "We've been thinking, Mrs. Wilson said hesitantly as she helped Clara with her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of cream-colored silk that Sarah Johnson had helped her sew. "Your father has been considering retirement for some time. Perhaps once you and the Marshal are settled, we might visit again." "For a longer stay." Clara looked up from the hem she was adjusting, startled. "You would consider that, leaving Philadelphia for Glenrio even temporarily?" Mrs. Wilson smoothed the fabric of the dress with careful fingers. "It's not what I expected, I'll admit, but there's something refreshing about this place, the directness of the people, the lack of pretension." She met Clara's eyes. "And you're happier here than I've ever seen you, even before the Richard debacle. You've found your place, Clara. Your father and I can see that clearly." Clara embraced her mother, tears threatening. "I would love for you to visit, for as long as you like." The wedding day dawned bright and clear, as if even the weather was celebrating their union. The small church was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and peering through the windows from outside. Clara, waiting in a side room with her father, felt a sense of peace and rightness that she had never experienced before her previous wedding, a certainty that this was meant to be. "Ready?" Mr. Wilson asked, offering his arm. Clara nodded, taking a deep breath. "More than ready." The church doors opened and Clara stepped into her future. Will stood at the altar, handsome in a new suit, his face lighting up as he saw her. The path to him seemed both endless and instantaneous. One moment she was at the church door, the next she was beside him, his warm hand taking hers. Reverend Cooper's words washed over them promises of fidelity, of partnership, of enduring love. When it came time for their vows, Will's voice was steady and sure, his eyes never leaving hers. Clara's own response came from the depths of her soul, a promise not just to Will but to herself, to the life they would build together. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend declared. "Marshal Rogers, you may kiss your bride." Will's kiss was gentle but profound, a sealing of their covenant before God and community. When they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Rogers, the cheers were deafening. The celebration afterwards spilled from the church to the town square, where tables had been set up for the feast. There was music and dancing, speeches and toasts, the entire town rejoicing in their union. Clara, moving through the crowd on Will's arm, felt a sense of belonging she had never known in Philadelphia's manicured ballrooms. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the square, Will leaned close to whisper in her ear. "Ready to see our home, Mrs. Rogers?" Clara nodded, suddenly eager for privacy after the long day of celebration. They made their goodbyes, enduring good-natured teasing from the townspeople and tearful embraces from Clara's parents, who would depart the following day. Will's house, their house now, stood on the outskirts of town, a sturdy two-story structure nestled among cottonwood trees. He had shown it to her before, of course, during their courtship, but tonight was different. Tonight she would stay. Will lifted her into his arms to carry her across the threshold, a tradition that made Clara laugh with joy as he shouldered open the door. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, a fire already burning in the hearth thanks to Mrs. Henderson's earlier preparations. "Welcome home, Clara Rogers," Will said, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her. Clara looked around at the simple, comfortable furnishings, the bookshelves already containing a mixture of his volumes and hers, the curtains she had sewn hanging at the windows. "It's perfect," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "Everything is perfect." Will's eyes darkened as he gazed down at her. "Everything," he agreed, before lowering his head to kiss her with a passion unrestrained by public scrutiny or propriety. Later, much later, as they lay entwined in the bedroom that was now theirs, Clara marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From Philadelphia debutante to jilted bride to frontier schoolteacher to beloved wife, each step, even the painful ones, had been necessary to lead her here, to this man, to this life. "What are you thinking?" Will murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Clara smiled in the darkness. I'm thinking about that first day when the women snickered at my dress and you told me I looked beautiful to you. Will's arms tightened around her. You did, you do, you always will. Even when I'm old and gray, she teased. Especially then, he assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. Because then I'll be old and gray too, and we'll have a lifetime of memories between us. Clara nestled closer, content in a way she had never imagined possible when she first stepped off that stagecoach. I love you, Will Rogers. And I love you, Clara Rogers, more than words can say. As they drifted toward sleep, Clara thought of all the tomorrows stretching before them, teaching her students, building their home, perhaps children of their own someday. Glenrio had given her more than refuge. It had given her a future, a community, a love that would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. Outside their window, the vast New Mexico sky spread like a blanket of stars, bearing witness to the simple truth that sometimes the end of one journey is merely the beginning of another, far greater adventure.